A man boarded the train alive. The next station held only questions warm. Journeys are built on assumptions. That boarding leads to arrival. That movement preserves what it carries. That what begins a journey will still exist when it ends. On this night, a man boarded the train alive. His ticket was valid. His presence was ordinary. Nothing about him invited attention. The doors closed. The train departed. The world outside slipped into darkness. Between one station and the next, nothing unusual was reported. No alarms, no sudden stops, no raised voices. And yet, when the train slowed again and the doors opened, certainty did not return with the light, because the man who had boarded was no longer there. Not injured, not asleep, not hidden, simply gone. What remained was not evidence, but confusion, not chaos, but questions. And as the train waited at the platform, doors open, systems functioning, the passengers began to understand that some journeys do not lose people loudly. Some remove them so quietly that the world only notices when it tries to count again. Proof of life. The man boarded the train at 11:57 p.m. The platform was neither crowded nor empty, just active enough to feel ordinary. People moved with the quiet efficiency of travelers who had done this before, their bodies trained to read signs, step aside, cue without thinking. The man joined them without hesitation. He did not rush. He did not linger. His shoes struck the metal step with a sound that blended seamlessly into the night's rhythm. The doors closed behind him with a practiced finality, sealing the carriage in warmth and light. Inside, the train smelled faintly of fabric cleaner and old air. Overhead lights hummed softly. Passengers adjusted bags, folded coats, slid phones into pockets. The small, unconscious rituals of departure played out exactly as they always did. The man took seat 12C, window side, middle carriage. He placed his ticket on his knee for a moment, then slipped it into his coat pocket. A slim leather wallet followed, tucked away with care. His movements were unremarkable, so unremarkable that they registered as proof of normality. Several passengers noticed him, not consciously, not memorably, but they noticed him the way people notice the weather or a passing sound, registering presence without assigning importance. A woman across the aisle shifted her legs to avoid brushing his bag. A student behind him leaned sideways to see past his shoulder. A man near the aisle nodded politely when their eyes met for a fraction of a second. These were not dramatic interactions. They were confirmations. The conductor entered the carriage as the train began to move, clipboard tucked beneath his arm, posture relaxed but attentive. His job at this hour was not enforcement, it was verification, ensuring that what had boarded was what remained. He walked slowly, checking seats in order. 11A, 11B, 11C. All occupied. He reached row 12. 12A occupied. 12B occupied. 12C. The conductor glanced at the man, then at his list. He marked the box beside the number without hesitation. The pen scratched the paper. The mark was made. Proof of life. The train picked up speed, the platform dissolving into darkness beyond the windows. Outside, the city thinned quickly, replaced by stretches of unlit track and scattered industrial lights. Inside, the carriage settled. The man leaned his head back slightly and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to rest them. His breathing was slow and steady. Nothing about him suggested discomfort or urgency. Time passed, not in minutes or seconds, but in sensations. The sway of the carriage, the muted clatter of rails, the subtle shifts as passengers adjusted their weight. The conductor finished his pass and returned to the front of the carriage. He leaned briefly against the partition, eyes scanning the rows out of habit rather than concern. Everything was correct. The man in seat 12C remained where he should be. Later, how much later was difficult to say, the conductor began his second walk. This was routine on night routes, a redundancy built into the system, proof that nothing had changed without permission. He moved again through the carriage, posture unchanged. 11A, 11B, 11C. Occupied. Row 12. 12A. Occupied. 12B. Occupied. 12C. The conductor stopped. The seat was empty. He frowned, not sharply, but with mild irritation. Passengers shifted all the time. People went to restrooms, stepped into vestibules, changed seats if space allowed. Absence did not automatically imply error. Still, the conductor checked the floor. No bag. He glanced toward the restroom at the end of the carriage. The door indicator glowed green, unoccupied. He waited a few seconds. Nothing changed. He checked the connecting door to the next carriage. Its indicator light was steady, locked since departure. The train had not slowed. No announcement had been made. No door had opened. The conductor returned to C12C and looked at it again. The cushion lay smooth, as though no one had sat there at all. The armrests were aligned. The space beneath the seat was clear. This detail unsettled him. Absence usually left some trace. He checked his list again. Seat 12C was marked, clearly, deliberately, in his own handwriting. He remembered the man, not his face, but the act of seeing him, of checking him, of marking the seat. That memory was solid. The conductor turned to the woman across the aisle. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Was someone sitting here earlier?" She looked at the seat, then nodded. "Yes." "When did he leave?" She hesitated. I don't know. I didn't see him stand up." He asked the student behind. The answer was the same. "He was there. I didn't notice him leave." The conductor felt a faint tightening in his chest, not fear, not panic. Recognition. This was not a misplaced passenger. This was a missing transition. He stood in the aisle for a moment, listening to the train's steady motion. Outside, darkness pressed close. Inside, the carriage felt suddenly smaller, its boundaries more definite. The man had boarded alive. He had been counted. He had been verified. And somewhere between departure and arrival, between one station and the next, he had ceased to exist in the only place that mattered. The conductor straightened and spoke calmly. "Please remain seated." The words sounded ordinary. They were not. Seat 12C remained empty. And for the first time that night, the conductor understood that this journey was no longer carrying everyone who had begun it. The interval where nothing happened. The conductor did not call for assistance right away. That decision surprised him later, but in the moment it felt natural. The system had not yet failed. It had merely presented an inconsistency, and inconsistencies were resolved every night without escalation. Seat 12C was empty. He stood beside it longer than necessary, listening to the soft, mechanical rhythm of the train as it carried them through uninterrupted darkness. Outside the windows, there were no towns, no crossings, no signals, only motion without reference. Inside, the carriage felt suspended. The conductor checked his watch. Time was passing normally. The seconds advanced with reassuring precision. Whatever had happened had not disturbed the clock. He walked to the restroom again, slower this time, pushing the door fully open. The light flickered once, then steadied. The room was clean, dry, undisturbed. No sign that anyone had been there. He closed the door and stood for a moment in the narrow aisle, weighing his next step. Procedures existed for missing passengers, but those procedures assumed an event, an argument, a medical emergency, a door opened at the wrong time. This was different. There had been no event. The conductor returned to seat 12C and looked at it with renewed focus. Earlier, the seat had felt freshly vacated. Now, that impression was fading. The cushion did not carry the subtle warmth that lingered even minutes after someone stood up. The fabric lay flat, impersonal, as if the seat had always been empty. The thought unsettled him enough that he straightened abruptly and moved on, scanning the rest of the carriage again. Faces looked back at him with neutral curiosity. No one appeared distressed. No one appeared confused. That, too, felt wrong. People reacted to disruptions, even small ones. A sudden stop, a loud sound, a raised voice. But here, the disruption existed only in the conductor's awareness. He stopped beside the woman across the aisle again. "You're sure someone was sitting there?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said immediately. "I remember adjusting my legs so I wouldn't bump his bag." "What kind of bag?" She frowned. I'm not sure." The conductor nodded slowly. Memory was present, but shallow. It confirmed existence without preserving detail. He moved down the aisle, asking variations of the same question. The answers aligned perfectly. Yes, someone was there. No, no one saw him leave. No, nothing unusual happened. The conductor felt a cold clarity settle in. This was not a disappearance that had occurred during something. It had occurred between moments, inside an interval so ordinary that it had gone completely unobserved. He took out his radio. "Control," he said quietly. "I have a passenger unaccounted for." The response came after a brief pause. "Clarify." Passenger confirmed present after departure, now absent. No stop, no door access. Another pause, longer this time. "Any disturbance?" Control asked. "No." "Witnesses?" "Yes. All confirm presence. None confirm departure." Control hesitated. "Recheck all carriages." "I have," the conductor said. "No match." "Remain calm. Continue monitoring." The line went silent. Monitoring. The word felt inadequate. The conductor returned to the front of the carriage and leaned against the partition, watching the rows from a distance. The train continued at full speed, its motion smooth and confident, as though the world itself approved of the journey's integrity. Passengers resumed their quiet routines. A man put on headphones. A woman adjusted her coat and closed her eyes. Someone yawned. Normality asserted itself. Seat 12C sat empty among occupied seats, its absence gradually losing urgency by proximity alone. The longer nothing happened, the harder it became to insist that something had. The conductor noticed something else, subtler but more troubling. His own sense of time was changing. He checked his watch again and was surprised by how little time had passed since the second count. It felt longer, stretched not by activity, but by uncertainty. The interval between presence and absence had no shape, no boundary to fix the mind on. It was simply missing. He took out his notebook and began writing. Not names, but observations. Time of boarding, seat number, first confirmation, second count discrepancy. The act of writing steadied him. Documentation gave weight to things that threatened to dissolve. But even as he wrote, he felt the effort required to maintain clarity. The man's presence was becoming harder to visualize, not because it was false, but because nothing reinforced it anymore. No one spoke about him unless prompted. No one reacted to the empty seat unless directed to. The conductor realized with a quiet shock that memory was already adapting. Reality did not like unresolved intervals. When it encountered one, it smoothed it over. He stood again and walked past seat 12C deliberately, forcing himself to acknowledge it. The seat did not resist his gaze. It did not demand explanation. It simply existed as empty space. A passenger nearby asked softly, "Is everything all right?" "Yes," the conductor replied automatically. The word came easily, too easily. The train moved on through the darkness, sealed and unbroken. Outside, the world offered no landmarks to confirm progress. Inside, the carriage began to feel self-contained, its own small system, adjusting quietly to a revised total. Seat 12C remained empty, and the conductor understood, with growing unease, that the most dangerous part of the disappearance was not that a man had vanished. It was that the interval where it happened contained nothing at all. No sound, no motion, no moment to point to and say, "There." Without an event, there could be no interruption. Without interruption, there could be no insistence that something was wrong. The train continued forward, and the interval where the man had ceased to exist closed behind it, unmarked, unnoticed, and already beginning to feel as though it had never been there at all. Witnesses without a moment. The conductor stopped asking when it had happened. The question no longer made sense. Time on the night express had begun to behave differently. Not faster or slower, but flatter. Moments did not flow into one another as they should. They sat beside each other, disconnected, like pages shuffled out of order. Seat 12C remained empty. The conductor stood near the middle of the carriage and looked down the aisle, trying to see it the way the passengers saw it now. Not as a loss, not even as an anomaly, just as space. People avoided the seat without realizing they were doing it. Their bodies adjusted instinctively, shifting bags, crossing legs, choosing different paths through the aisle. These were not acts of fear or superstition. They were corrections made without conscious thought. The mind, it seemed, was already rewriting the environment. The conductor approached a man seated 2 rows ahead. "Do you remember the passenger in seat 12C?" he asked quietly. The man nodded. "Yes." "What do you remember about him?" The man hesitated longer than expected. "He was there." Anything else? The man frowned. Not really. The conductor moved on. Each passenger confirmed the same thing: presence without detail, existence without narrative. They remembered that the man had boarded, that he had occupied space, but not how. No voice, no gesture, no defining moment. It was as though the man had entered the train already stripped of identity, reduced to a variable in a count. The conductor returned to the seat and sat down briefly, occupying the space the man had once taken. The cushion compressed under his weight. The armrests felt cool. Nothing resisted him. He imagined the man sitting here earlier. Imagined the pressure his body would have left, the warmth that should have lingered. But the seat offered no memory. It accepted the conductor without hesitation, as though it had been waiting. He stood again quickly, unsettled. The problem was no longer that the man was gone. The problem was that nothing remembered him being here. Not the seat, not the floor, not the air, only the list. The conductor took out his notebook again. The entry beside seat 12C remained clear and precise. Ink on paper. Physical proof that something had once aligned differently. He traced the number with his finger. 12C. A coordinate without a subject. He wondered how long the mark would continue to feel meaningful. Ink lasted longer than memory, but meaning did not obey the same rules. Across the aisle, two passengers spoke softly. "I keep thinking I should remember him better," one said. The other shrugged. "Why? He didn't do anything." The words struck the conductor sharply. He didn't do anything. In a system built on movement, ticketing, and verification, doing nothing was the most dangerous state of all. It left no disturbance, no imprint, no justification for preservation. The conductor stood and resumed walking, slower now, his awareness sharpening around small details. He noticed how conversations avoided the subject unless prompted, how eyes slid away from the empty seat as if it offered no reward. Earlier, the absence had drawn attention. Now, attention avoided it. That transition frightened him. He leaned against the partition again and closed his eyes briefly. The sound of the train filled the space behind his thoughts, steady, confident, indifferent. The train did not know someone was missing. It only knew that it was complete enough to continue. The conductor opened his eyes and looked again at seat 12C. He tried one final experiment. He addressed the carriage calmly. "We're verifying a count. Please let me know if anyone remembers the man who was sitting in seat 12C. The response was immediate and deeply unsettling. Several passengers nodded, but no one spoke. The conductor waited. Silence. They remembered. They simply did not feel compelled to elaborate. That was when he understood. The disappearance had passed a threshold. It was no longer an unresolved event. It was becoming a non-event. Reality was not denying that the man had existed. It was demoting that fact, lowering its priority until it no longer required explanation. The conductor felt a quiet urgency rise in him, not panic, but resistance. He alone still felt the weight of the contradiction. He alone still carried the expectation that presence should leave evidence. He wondered how long that would last. Memory, after all, was not just recall, it was maintenance. And maintenance required effort. The train moved on through the dark countryside. its windows reflecting only vague shapes and passing lights. Inside, the carriage breathed evenly, its rhythm Seat 12C remained empty. And somewhere between the certainty of boarding and the expectation of arrival, the world had decided that witnesses did not require a moment, only agreement. Agreement that nothing worth interrupting the journey had occurred. The conductor stood quietly, feeling the ground shift beneath his understanding. The man had been alive. He had been counted. He had been seen. And yet, without a moment to anchor his disappearance, his existence was already dissolving, slipping not into mystery, but into irrelevance. The train continued forward, and the witnesses, having lost the moment, were beginning to lose the man. Authority without an incident. The announcement came without emphasis. "We will be arriving at the next station shortly." The conductor's voice carried through the carriage with practiced calm. It was the kind of announcement designed to reassure, proof that the journey remained structured, that arrival still followed movement. Passengers stirred. Some straightened in their seats. Others reached for bags or checked their phones. Arrival introduced witnesses. Platforms brought light, personnel, procedure. For the conductor, this station represented the last remaining friction point, the final place where the disappearance might resist being absorbed. Seat 12C remained empty. The train slowed, its motion easing into a controlled glide beneath the white glare of platform lights. The sudden brightness felt invasive after the long stretch of darkness. Edges sharpened, faces became clearer. The carriage was exposed. The doors opened. Sound rushed in, footsteps, distant announcements, the metallic echo of another train departing. Life continuing at full volume. Two station officials boarded calmly, clipboards in hand. Their movements were efficient, confident, unhurried. People who expected systems to behave. The conductor explained quietly, keeping his voice low. Passenger confirmed present after departure is no longer on board. No stop, no door access. One official nodded. Which seat? 12C. They approached together. The official nearest the seat paused, looked down at it, then around the carriage. His expression registered mild interest, nothing more. "This seat is empty," he said. "Yes," the conductor replied. "It wasn't earlier." The official crouched, checking beneath the seat, then straightened. "Any belongings?" "No." "Witnesses?" "Yes, multiple." "Any disturbance reported?" "No." The official made a note, then closed his clipboard. "From what we can see, everyone currently on board is accounted for." The conductor felt a hollow sensation open in his chest. "But someone is missing," he said carefully. The official tilted his head. "Missing from where?" The question landed with unexpected force. "From the train," the conductor said. The official shook his head gently. "We don't have anyone missing from this train. Everyone present has a ticket. Everyone present has a seat." The words were delivered without dismissal or hostility. They were simply final. Authority did not deny the conductor's experience. It declined to validate it. The officials completed a brief walk through the carriage, thanked the passengers for their patience, and stepped back onto the platform. The doors closed behind them with a soft, definitive sound. The whistle blew. The train moved on. As the station slid away into darkness once more, the conductor realized what had just happened. The absence had been reviewed and accepted. Passengers shifted in their seats. A woman exhaled quietly, shoulders relaxing. A man leaned back and closed his eyes. The tension that had once sharpened awareness dissolved into something heavier and more inert. Resignation. Seat 12C remained empty, but now it no longer felt like a problem waiting to be solved. It felt authorized. The conductor returned to the front of the carriage, posture unchanged, expression professional. Inside, something had settled into place with uncomfortable permanence. The system had spoken, and the system did not recognize loss unless it disrupted function. The train continued through the night, its rhythm steady, its purpose intact. Outside, the darkness returned, uninterrupted and indifferent. The conductor looked down the aisle again. Passengers were calm. Seats were filled. Order was restored. Except for one small, precise detail. Seat 12C remained empty. And now, no one expected it to be otherwise. The conductor felt the last of his urgency drain away, not because he had accepted what had happened, but because there was no longer anywhere for urgency to go. There would be no report to escalate, no authority to appeal to. The disappearance had passed through the only corrective mechanism available to it, and emerged unchanged. He thought briefly of the man, of the certainty that had once anchored his presence. That certainty now felt distant, oddly fragile, like a memory recalled too many times. The conductor understood then that the journey had crossed an irreversible threshold. Before the station, the absence had been a contradiction. After the station, it had become a condition. The train did not need to understand it. It only needed to continue. Seat 12C remained empty as the night express carried on, its wheels tracing familiar lines through darkness. And somewhere between departure and arrival, the world had quietly decided that nothing was wrong. The calm that followed. Confirmation. After the station disappeared behind them, the night express did not feel unsettled. It felt corrected. The train gathered speed smoothly, its motion confident and uninterrupted. Outside, the lights thinned and vanished, replaced once again by open darkness. Inside, the carriage settled into a quieter rhythm, one that no longer carried expectation. Seat 12C remained empty. The conductor stood near the front of the carriage, hands resting loosely at his sides, listening to the familiar hum of machinery. He waited for something, an aftershock, a delayed reaction, a sense of wrongness that might reassert itself now that authority had stepped away. Nothing came. Passengers resumed their routines with a startling ease. Bags were shifted, sleeves rolled up. A few people leaned back and closed their eyes, surrendering to the gentle sway of the train. No one spoke about the missing man. The conductor walked the aisle again, slower this time, his steps measured, but no longer urgent. When he passed seat 12C, he noticed that his eyes did not linger as they once had. That realization stopped him. He turned back and looked deliberately at the empty space, forcing himself to confront it. The seat did not pull at his attention. It did not resist his gaze. It existed quietly, indistinguishable from any other empty seat on any other journey. Earlier, it had felt like a wound in the pattern. Now it felt like part of the design. A man stood to stretch near the aisle and paused briefly beside seat 12C. The conductor watched closely, expecting hesitation or recognition. The man glanced down, frowned faintly, as if puzzled by his own pause, then continued walking. He did not sit. He did not question why. Later, if asked, he would not have been able to explain the choice. It didn't feel like an option, he might have said. The conductor felt a subtle tightening in his chest. Choice implied awareness. This was something else. He resumed his checks, moving through the carriage with practiced precision. Numbers matched. Tickets aligned. Every passenger present belonged exactly where they were. The system functioned flawlessly. With one exception, it no longer seemed to acknowledge. When the conductor reached the end of the carriage, he realized he had not opened his notebook once during the entire walk. The thought unsettled him. Earlier, the notebook had been an anchor, physical proof that the contradiction existed. Now, the urge to consult it had faded, replaced by a strange sense that documentation itself was unnecessary. The system no longer needed proof. It had adapted. The conductor sat briefly in the fold-down seat near the partition, watching the carriage from a distance. From this angle, seat 12C was barely noticeable, its emptiness no longer framed by attention. Passengers' gazes slid past it naturally, their bodies adjusted around it. They were not avoiding the seat consciously, they were forgetting it. A woman across the aisle spoke softly to her companion. "I always feel calmer after stops," she said. "Like things reset." Her companion nodded. "Yeah, like everything's back where it should be." The conductor closed his eyes for a moment. Back where it should be. The phrase echoed unpleasantly, because by every rule he understood, something was not where it should be. And yet, the carriage behaved as though it were. He took out his notebook again, almost reluctantly, and opened it to the passenger list. The entry for seat 12C still stared back at him, unchanged. The name looked correct, but it no longer felt anchored. It felt like a mistake the system had already moved past. The conductor considered briefly what would happen if he crossed the name out. The idea came easily, too easily, like straightening a crooked line. The thought frightened him enough that he closed the notebook quickly and slid it back into his pocket. Across the carriage, a passenger asked quietly, "Are we on time?" "Yes," the conductor replied automatically. And it was true. The train was exactly on schedule. The disappearance had not delayed anything. That fact carried its own quiet menace. If the loss of a person did not slow the system, even for a moment, then the system had no incentive to resist it. The conductor looked down the aisle again. Passengers rested. Lights glowed steadily. The train moved forward without effort. Seat 12C remained empty. But now, its emptiness felt permanent. Not because anyone had decided it should be, but because the journey had learned how to continue without questioning it. The conductor felt the shape of the truth settle into place. The system had not failed. It had succeeded. It had absorbed an anomaly without disrupting continuity, and in doing so, it had demonstrated something deeply unsettling. That presence was conditional. That existence, within a perfectly functioning system, was only guaranteed as long as it did not interrupt the flow. The conductor leaned back and exhaled slowly. He was no longer waiting for the man to reappear. That expectation had dissolved somewhere after the station. Now, he was waiting for something else, for the moment when even he would stop expecting the absence to matter. The train pressed onward through the night, smooth and assured. Seat 12C remained empty, and with every passing mile, the journey grew more confident in its correction, carrying forward what remained and leaving behind what no longer fit, without ceremony, without alarm, and without ever acknowledging that anything had been lost at all. When even memory began to agree. The change was subtle enough that the conductor almost missed it. It was not announced. It did not arrive with resistance. It revealed itself through ease. Some time after midnight passed into early morning, after the carriage had settled into its most stable rhythm, the conductor realized he had walked past seat 12C twice without consciously registering it. The awareness struck him mid-step. He stopped, turned, and looked back. The seat was empty. That fact did not shock him. What shocked him was that it had failed to demand his attention. Earlier in the journey, the empty seat had pulled at his awareness like a loose thread, visible, irritating, impossible to ignore. Now it existed with the same neutrality as any other unoccupied space. The conductor felt a quiet unease take hold. This was not resolution. This was agreement. Passengers slept or rested with eyes closed. A man near the window breathed evenly, head tilted against the glass. A woman 2 rows back shifted in her seat and sighed, adjusting her scarf without waking. No one reacted to the empty space. No one guarded against it. The conductor walked the aisle again, deliberately slowing his pace, forcing himself to notice what others no longer did. As he passed seat 12C, he stopped and rested a hand on the seatback. The fabric was cool, neutral, unremarkable. There was no lingering sense that someone had once been there, not physically, and now not mentally either. He withdrew his hand and straightened. Across the aisle, a man stirred awake briefly and glanced around the carriage. His eyes passed over seat 12C without pause, then continued on. The conductor watched closely. Nothing. No flicker of confusion, no hesitation. The man's attention moved on, as though the space had always been empty. The conductor felt something inside him tighten, not fear, not panic, but a quiet recognition that something essential was slipping away. Memory was aligning, not correcting itself, conforming. He took out his notebook again, slower than before. The act felt heavier now, as though he were lifting something that no longer wished to be held. The page was unchanged. Seat 12C, marked, confirmed. The ink remained dark and deliberate, but the meaning behind it was thinning. He tried to recall the man again, to rebuild him from fragments. The way he'd held his ticket, the way he'd settled into his seat. But the details refused to assemble. What remained was certainty without substance. The conductor closed the notebook and pressed it against his thigh, grounding himself in its physical weight. Around him the carriage breathed evenly. The train moved forward with complete confidence. The system was no longer compensating. It had finished adjusting. The conductor realized, then, that something far more unsettling than disappearance had occurred. The system had not erased the man. It had rewritten the context in which he had existed. Seat 12C was no longer empty because someone vanished. It was simply empty. And emptiness, the mind understood, required no explanation. A passenger nearby stirred and asked softly, half asleep, "Is this the last stop?" "Not yet," the conductor replied. The exchange felt ordinary, comforting, dangerously so. The conductor leaned against the partition and closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, he forced himself to look at seat 12C as though seeing it for the first time. What he saw was not absence. What he saw was permission. The world had allowed the correction to stand. He imagined the end of the journey, passengers disembarking, doors opening, morning light filling the carriage. He imagined the empty seat being cleaned, prepared for the next run, its history erased not by force, but by irrelevance. He imagined himself filling out reports or deciding not to. He imagined telling the story later, only to find the words felt exaggerated, unsupported, thin. A man disappeared. No one saw him leave. The story already sounded implausible, even to him. The conductor understood. Then that the most fragile part of any system was not its rules. It was its memory. Rules enforced continuity. Memory enforced meaning. And memory was already conceding. He took a slow breath and looked down the aisle again. Passengers slept. Lights glowed steadily. The train moved forward without hesitation. Seat 12C remained empty. But now, even that felt like the wrong way to describe it. It was no longer empty of something, it was simply available. The conductor felt the final resistance draining from him, not because he accepted what had happened, but because resisting it required effort the journey no longer supported. Reality had reached consensus. The man had boarded. The man had been counted. And now, without violence, without sound, without record, the world had quietly agreed to continue as though he had never mattered enough to delay it. The train pressed onward into the deepening morning. Seat 12C waited, and the conductor, standing watch over a system that no longer needed him to remember, understood that the disappearance was complete, not because the man was gone, but because memory itself had decided to let him go. The last person still counting. By the time the sky outside the window softened from black to gray, the night express had entered its quietest state. Not silence, but certainty. The conductor stood near the front of the carriage, posture relaxed in a way that no longer felt chosen. His body had adapted faster than his thoughts. Muscles loosened, breathing slowed. The urgency that had once sharpened every step had thinned into something dull and manageable. Seat 12C remained empty. He noticed it now only when he made himself notice it. That, he understood, was the final warning. Passengers stirred as morning approached. Some woke gradually, blinking against the pale light. Others remained asleep, their bodies swaying gently with the motion of the train. Phones lit briefly, then dimmed again. Small routines reasserted themselves. No one spoke about the missing man, not because they were suppressing the thought, but because the thought no longer formed. The conductor walked the aisle again, performing the motions of his role with practiced ease. He checked tickets, answered quiet questions, nodded politely. Each interaction reinforced the illusion that the journey was proceeding exactly as intended. When he reached row 12, he hesitated, only for a moment. Seat 12C sat open, unobstructed, offering nothing that demanded attention. The conductor realized, with a subtle shock, that if he were boarding this train for the first time, the empty seat would not strike him as unusual at all. That realization carried weight. It meant the correction was complete. He paused beside the seat and rested his hand lightly on the armrest. The material was cool, clean, neutral. The seat accepted the contact without resistance. Nothing about it suggested loss. Across the aisle, a woman opened her eyes and watched him briefly, curiosity flickering and then fading. She did not ask a question. She did not look at the seat. The conductor moved on. He was aware now that he was the only person still carrying the contradiction, not as a mystery, but as a responsibility. Everyone else had relinquished it without noticing. Memory, behavior, expectation, all had aligned. Only his notebook resisted. He returned to the front and removed it from his pocket again, feeling its weight more keenly than before. He opened it to the page he knew by heart. Seat 12C. The name was still there. The ink had not changed, but the context had. He understood now that the notebook was no longer documentation. It was dissent. As long as the entry remained, some version of the missing man endured, not in the world, but in opposition to it. A contradiction preserved by refusal rather than necessity. The conductor closed the notebook slowly. He did not cross the name out. Not yet. Outside, the first true daylight appeared. Fields resolved into clear shapes. Roads emerged. The world beyond the train looked ordinary again, predictable, governed by rules that daylight insisted upon. The train did not slow. The conductor realized then that the system no longer needed his vigilance. Everything that could adapt had already done so. The absence no longer threatened coherence. What remained was choice, not about what had happened, but about what would be remembered. He imagined the end of the journey, the final station, passengers stepping off, absorbed instantly back into their lives. He imagined himself filing paperwork or choosing not to. He imagined weeks passing, the story growing thinner each time he thought about it. A man boarded, a man disappeared. Without witnesses willing to insist on detail, the story would erode. He was the last person who could still insist. The conductor felt no heroism in that realization, only fatigue. Memory required effort. It asked the mind to resist comfort, to hold onto friction. The world did not reward that resistance. It rewarded smoothness, continuity, flow. The conductor looked down the aisle one more time. Passengers were calm. The carriage was orderly. The journey was intact. Seat 12C remained empty. And for the first time, the conductor wondered, not with fear, but with quiet resignation, whether insisting on remembering served any purpose at all. If no one else required the contradiction, if the system functioned better without it, was memory an obligation or an indulgence? The train moved steadily forward, its motion unwavering. The conductor stood still, feeling the questions settle into place. He was no longer guarding against disappearance. He was guarding against forgetting. And with each mile, he understood more clearly that forgetting would be easier. The journey did not ask him to decide. It simply continued. Seat 12C remained open, waiting. Not for a passenger, but for the moment when even the last person still counting would decide that the number no longer mattered. When the doors opened again, the announcement came without emphasis. "We will be arriving at the next station shortly." The conductor's voice carried through the carriage with the same calm precision it always had. The words produced movement, not reaction, bags lifted, shoulders straightened, phones checked for messages waiting on the other side of the journey. Arrival was procedural. Seat 12C remained empty. The train slowed, its forward momentum easing into a controlled glide as the platform lights emerged from the morning haze. White lamps cut through the windows, flattening shadows, erasing the last refuge of ambiguity that night had provided. The train came to a stop, the doors opened, cool air entered the carriage, along with the layered sounds of the station, footsteps, announcements, the distant hum of another train departing. The outside world asserted itself, loud and confident, full of witnesses. Passengers stood. One by one, they stepped into the aisle, forming an orderly line toward the doors. This was the moment the conductor had been waiting for, though he had not admitted it to himself. Disembarkation did not allow subtlety. Bodies moved. Space changed shape. Presence could not vanish without being noticed. If the man had been overlooked rather than erased, this was where the oversight would correct itself. Passengers passed seat 12C. No one paused. No one hesitated. The conductor stood near the doors, watching faces closely as they crossed the threshold. Each person stepped off carrying their presence fully, counted, complete, unambiguous. Seat 12C was passed again. Still nothing. When the last passenger disembarked, the carriage emptied completely. The silence that followed was different from the quiet of night. It was clean, exposed, stripped of expectation. Without people, the carriage looked smaller, more exact, rows aligned, surfaces smooth, nothing out of place. The conductor remained inside. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing softly against the floor. He stopped beside seat 12C and looked at it under the unforgiving clarity of station light. The fabric was unmarked, the armrests aligned. The space beneath was clear. There was no trace of recent occupation. He placed his hand on the seat back. It was cool, neutral. The absence did not feel temporary. It felt resolved. The conductor stepped off the train briefly and stood on the platform, turning to look back inside through the open doors. From this angle, the empty seat did not stand out at all. It blended seamlessly into the geometry of the carriage, just another space waiting for the next journey. The world had looked inside, and it had found nothing missing. The doors closed, the whistle sounded, the train prepared to depart again. The conductor returned to his place and sat down as the train began to move, feeling the familiar shift of motion beneath his feet. The carriage, empty now, absorbed the movement without resistance. Outside, the station slid away. With it went the last opportunity for correction. The conductor understood then that arrival had not threatened the disappearance. It had confirmed it. Daylight had examined the absence and found it acceptable. The train gathered speed once more, carrying empty seats and mechanical certainty forward into the morning. The conductor closed his eyes briefly and tried one final time to recall the man's face. He could not. The memory no longer resisted. He knew the man had boarded. He knew he had been counted. But the image itself was gone, released without ceremony. The past was adjusting. Seat 12C remained empty as the night express moved on, not suspiciously, not ominously, simply so. The conductor felt a quiet finality settle in him. The disappearance had passed its last test. The doors had opened, the world had checked, and reality, satisfied, had allowed the journey to continue, as though nothing had ever been wrong at all. The record that no longer needed him. Morning established itself fully as the night express moved into the last stretch of its route. Sunlight no longer crept, it claimed. Fields sharpened into color. Roads appeared with certainty. The world beyond the windows looked stable again, governed by rules that daylight insisted were reliable. Inside the carriage, new passengers boarded at the next stop. They moved with purpose, refreshed by sleep or driven by routine. Tickets were scanned, seats were chosen without hesitation. Conversations resumed in low, practical tones, meetings, connections, breakfast plans. Seat 12C remained empty. No one asked if it was available. No one paused beside it. The conductor watched this with a sense of quiet detachment. There had been a time, only hours ago, when this moment would have tightened his chest. Now it produced something closer to recognition. This was how the correction completed itself. He walked the aisle again, performing his checks in the bright neutrality of morning. Numbers aligned, faces matched names, everything balanced cleanly. When he reached row 12, his pen hovered, only briefly. Seat 12C, unoccupied. He marked it. The action was automatic. The conductor froze afterward, pen still touching the page. He had not questioned the mark. He had not hesitated. The system had moved through him without resistance. He closed the notebook slowly, feeling a weight lift rather than settle. The list now reflected the reality around him, not the contradiction he had once fought to preserve. Seat 12C was empty, and the record agreed. He took his place near the front of the carriage and leaned lightly against the partition. Passengers moved around him, comfortable, assured. Their presence felt complete in a way that required no defense. The conductor realized something then that surprised him with its gentleness. He was no longer afraid of forgetting. The fear had passed. What remained was something quieter. Acceptance without relief. Understanding without satisfaction. The notebook in his pocket no longer felt like proof. It felt like a relic, a record of a version of the journey that no longer existed. He imagined opening it later, days from now, weeks, and reading the earlier entries. He imagined how strange they would look out of context. A seat marked occupied that no longer matched any living memory. He suspected he would assume he had made a mistake, a miscount, a smudge of ink, a lapse in attention during a late shift. That explanation would be easier than the truth. The conductor watched the countryside roll past, steady and indifferent. The train's motion felt smoother now, unburdened by contradiction. The system had reached equilibrium. Seat 12C blended seamlessly into the carriage, not avoided, not emphasized, simply available. A passenger sat in 12B and stretched her legs, letting them rest partially into the empty space beside her. The movement was casual, unthinking. She did not look down. She did not ask permission. The conductor felt no alarm. The moment passed like any other. He understood then that the disappearance had fully transitioned. It was no longer an unresolved event. It was no longer even a remembered one. It had become background. The train slowed again as the final station approached. Announcements echoed softly through the carriage. Passengers gathered belongings with the familiar impatience of arrival. The conductor remained still, watching the journey prepare to conclude. He thought of the man, not as an image, but as a fact. A man boarded the train alive. He was counted. He was confirmed. Those statements were still true, but they no longer mattered. Truth, he realized, was not what the system preserved. Continuity was. The train did not care what had been true once. It cared only that everything aligned now. Seat 12C remained empty. And for the first time since the disappearance, the conductor understood that there was nothing left to guard. The record had closed, not because it had been corrected, but because it had become unnecessary. The system no longer needed him to remember. And that, perhaps, was the most complete form of disappearance there was. The train that continued without a witness. The final station arrived without ceremony. Sunlight filled the carriage completely now, clear and unforgiving, revealing every surface in honest detail. There were no shadows left to soften edges or hide uncertainty. The night express slowed smoothly and came to rest beneath the wide canopy of the terminal, its brakes releasing a final, controlled sigh. The doors opened. Passengers stood, collected their belongings, and moved into the aisle with practiced ease. Morning voices replaced night silence, quiet conversations, polite apologies, the sound of rolling bags. Life resumed exactly where it expected to. Seat 12C remained empty. No one paused. Beside it, no one looked twice. The conductor stood at the front of the carriage, watching the final moments of the journey unfold. Each passenger passed him carrying a complete version of themselves, awake, accounted for, present. They stepped off the train and into the world without hesitation. When the last passenger disembarked, the carriage was empty. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was neutral, functional. The kind of quiet that existed only between one use and the next. The conductor remained inside for a moment longer. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing softly against the floor. Without people, the carriage looked smaller, more precise. Rows aligned, seats identical, nothing drawing attention. He stopped beside seat 12C. In the full clarity of morning, it was impossible to imagine why this seat had ever mattered. It was no different from any other. Same fabric, same wear, same angle of light across the armrest. He rested his hand briefly on the seat back. There was no sensation, no lingering warmth, no impression. Nothing to suggest a presence had ever occupied the space. The conductor withdrew his hand and exhaled slowly. He took the notebook from his pocket and opened it one last time. The page fell naturally to the entry he had avoided since dawn. Seat 12C. The name was still there. Clear, legible, unchanged. The ink had not faded, but its meaning had. The conductor considered striking it through, drawing a clean line that would restore balance to the page. The thought came easily, almost automatically, like correcting a clerical error. Then he stopped. He understood with a quiet certainty that crossing it out would not correct the record. It would complete the disappearance. As long as the entry remained, some trace of contradiction endured. Not enough to disrupt the system, not enough to demand explanation, but enough to suggest that something had once passed through the journey without being carried forward. He closed the notebook and returned it to his pocket. Outside, the platform moved with ordinary purpose. Another train arrived, another departed. Announcements echoed and faded. Schedules held. The conductor turned off the carriage lights one by one, the interior dimming gently. He walked to the door and stepped onto the platform, pulling it closed behind him. The night express stood ready for its next departure. Clean, orderly, whole. No report would be filed. There was nothing left to escalate, nothing left to prove. By every measurable standard, the journey had been successful. The conductor paused and looked back at the train through the glass. The man had boarded. That fact had once been undeniable. The man had vanished. That fact had once demanded explanation. Now, both truths existed without conflict, one fading quietly, the other already absorbed. The train did not need to resolve the contradiction. It only needed to continue. As the conductor turned away, he understood the final shape of what had happened. The night express had not lost a passenger. It had lost a witness. Without someone insisting on the discrepancy, the disappearance no longer required acknowledgement. Reality did not erase the man violently or dramatically. It simply moved forward until there was no one left to remember him strongly enough to interrupt the journey. The train departed again on schedule, carrying new passengers who would never know that someone had once occupied a seat that now felt entirely ordinary. Seat 12C remained empty, not as evidence, not as warning, but as the quiet proof that existence within a perfectly functioning system depended not on truth, but on being noticed long enough to matter. Some journeys end with arrival. This one ended with agreement. A man boarded the train alive. He was counted. He was confirmed. And then the system continued. No alarms sounded. No rule was broken. The train arrived exactly on time. Perhaps that is the most unsettling truth. Not that someone vanished, but that the world did not need a witness to go on. That memory is optional. That continuity is preferred over truth. So the next time you travel, late at night or early in the morning, pause for a moment. Look at the empty seats. Look at the numbers. Notice what feels normal. Because once nothing asks the question anymore, the answer no longer matters.